Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 11, The Frankish Succession and the Breakup of Theodoric's Kingdom. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Clovis continued to expand until he threatened the Visigoths. An alliance with the Burgundians ensured the defeat of Alaric at Vieux, and he died in the battle. Alaric was succeeded by his illegitimate son Gesalic, but the new king proved unable to cope with an invasion by the Franks and the Burgundians. Fortunately, Theodoric sent an army that drove out the invaders, but he saw an opportunity to force Gesalic off the throne in favor of his grandson Amalaric. Unsurprisingly, Gesalic resisted but was defeated, even with support from the Vandals. Actually, Theodoric realized that his grandson was too young to rule, so Theodoric made himself king of the Goths in Italy and the Goths in Hispania. Meanwhile, Clovis had taken control of the other main Frankish kingdom, but he died in 511. Since he had 4 sons, it is worth asking if the kingdom would break apart. Clovis's eldest son Theodoric was an adult and experienced, since he already ruled Austrasia. Well, Theodoric had 3 younger half-brothers, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar. Theodoric may have been fond of them, but he probably did not want to share the kingdom with them. However, their mother Clotilde controlled the royal treasury, so she was able to force her stepson Theodoric to accept a relatively equal division between the 4 sons. As ever, the pragmatic truth is that enough Frankish lords backed Clotilde, otherwise Theodoric could have simply marched in and claimed the entire kingdom. This equitable division of the kingdom between the brothers would be later cited as evidence of Frankish tradition, but honestly, there is no evidence that this was a real tradition. Little is known about the Franks before Clovis. The dynasty was called the Merovingian dynasty after Clovis's grandfather Merovich, and that is all that is known about him. Clovis's father Childeric had already appeared in records as a leader of a Frankish warband, but there is little information available about his family. Clovis had inherited leadership of a large warband of Franks and greatly expanded his territory, forcing all of the Franks to acknowledge his rule. As a result, his sons inherited a Frankish kingdom that included much of modern France, the Benelux nations, and part of Western Germany. Honestly, an impressive accomplishment. Again, the details are not clear, but none of Clovis's relatives seem to have survived the wars of expansion, either dying while fighting for him or against him. Regardless, there were no relatives or leaders of rival warbands left living to oppose his sons when he died. Actually, the Frankish kingdom would have been expected to break up following the death of Clovis, but the 4 sons remained relatively united, or at least they focused on expanding outwards rather than against each other. From our perspective, the key problem is that we simply have little information about the actions of Clovis's sons. The primary source on the Franks is Gregory of Tours, but he did not know much about the 4 brothers and apparently had little interest. Born in 540, Gregory became a bishop in 573, succeeding a relative as bishop. He died in 594, and much of his work covers the period 581 to 591, basically his adulthood. Worse, there are few sources from the neighboring kingdoms that dealt with the Franks during the 50 years after the death of Clovis. So, what was Theodoric doing while the sons of Clovis attempted to expand their lands? Mainly trying to ensure a stable succession. Hispania was especially tricky. The Visigothic nobles had suffered 2 massive blows to their shared ego. First, they had been defeated by the Franks, admittedly aided by the Burgundians. Then they had lost their independence when Gesalic was defeated by Theodoric's army. Honestly, many landowners in Hispania probably saw little difference in their lives since taxes continued to flow north to foreign overlords. There were no revolts after 511, but that does not indicate support for Theodoric's rule among Visigoth nobles, just an unwillingness to risk their lives after several years of warfare. Recognizing the simmering resentment, Theodoric arranged for a Visigothic noble named Eutharic to marry his daughter Amalasuentha in 515. The decision to make a Visigoth his heir would hopefully create a smooth succession in both Italy and Hispania. Interesting, Theodoric made his son-in-law Eutharic his successor rather than his actual nephew, Theodahad, even though Theodahad's sister had married the king of the Thuringians, who lived near the Burgundians, and he had basically made himself king of Tuscany. Taking the succession seriously, Theodoric even worked to improve relations with the Eastern Empire. As I explained in episode 9, the papacy had come to terms with the new barbarian overlords, so the Pope helped Theodoric negotiate the emperor's adoption of Eutharic. Theodoric was at his peak and appeared to have gained full recognition by the emperor in Constantinople. Actually, there was no guarantee that Eutharic would have received the loyalty of the Goths when Theodoric died, since he was virtually unknown in Italy when he married Amalasuentha. Presumably, Theodoric hoped that Eutharic would gain some supporters once he was the official heir, except Eutharic died in 522. The death of Eutharic ended Theodoric's web of marriage alliances while he still lived, as if the various kings had accepted that they did not need to fear an old man who had failed to produce an heir. The first to act was King Sigismund in Burgundy, who had his son Segedic executed in 522. The murder of his son with Ostrogoth, Theodoric's daughter, seems harsh, but Sigismund clearly wanted to ensure that the Ostrogoths did not have a claim to Burgundy. I think that Sigismund's reaction needs a bit of context. While he never made a public announcement to explain the murder, it seems likely that Sigismund was motivated by the example of Gesalic, who was pushed off the Visigoth throne by Theodoric in favor of his grandson Amalaric. Why did Sigismund believe that he could murder Theodoric's grandson without any repercussions? The Burgundians had suffered the most damage from Theodoric's counteroffensive in 508, losing all of their new lands. When Theodoric's son-in-law Sigismund succeeded his father Gundobad as king in 516, he decided that he was tired of Burgundy's precarious position between the Franks and the Goths, so he looked to Constantinople for support. In addition, Sigismund promptly banned the Homoian Church, possibly to strengthen the fragile alliance with Constantinople. However, the alliance was not very strong, since the empire did not protect him when Theodoric sent an army to avenge the murder of his grandson. Sigismund was preparing to face the Goths when Clodomir invaded and defeated the Burgundians. Sigismund and his family were thrown in a well, but Sigismund's brother Godomar became king. Clodomir invaded again, this time with his brothers Childebert and Clothar. Godomar proved to be a more effective general than Sigismund, and the Franks retreated after Clodomir was killed. Wait, why didn't Childebert and Clothar stay to avenge their brother? Apparently, the two remaining brothers concluded that it would be easier to divide up Clodomir's lands rather than continue a difficult war against the Burgundians. Still, Theodoric's general Tuluin was able to gain control over part of Burgundy in 523, but the revenge was costly since it weakened a buffer kingdom. That same year, Thrasimund died and was succeeded by his cousin Hilderic as king of the Vandals and the Alans. Hilderic's mother was Eudocia, daughter of Emperor Valentinian III. Just a quick reminder. At one point, the Roman nobles had feared Eudocia's marriage to the son of a barbarian king because her son would be a potential claimant to the Western Roman Empire. Wow, that feels like such a long time ago. Clearly, Hilderic resented Theodoric's attempt to use marriage alliances to bind the neighboring kingdoms into a hegemony under his domination, since he promptly slaughtered the Gothic guard of Thrasimund's widow, Theodoric's daughter Amalafrida, who was thrown into a cell where she died. North Africa was far away, but Theodoric ordered the assembly of a fleet to rescue his daughter. However, the fleet was not ready by 526, so Theodoric's death that year ensured that the fleet would not sail. While Theodoric's initial succession plan had failed when his son-in-law died, the succession was initially smooth, so his grandson Eutharic succeeded him as king of the Ostrogoths, even though he was at most 10 years old. Were there no alternatives to a child? Actually, yes. In fact, there were two. Theodoric's nephew Theodahad and Tuluin, who had led a victorious campaign against the Burgundians. Both men received generous rewards after they accepted Eutharic as king. The question is, how long would they remain satisfied with their rewards? However, a more immediate question was whether Hispania would remain part of the Greater Gothic Kingdom. Remember, Theodoric had another grandson, Amalric, born to Theodogotho, Theodoric's daughter. Theodoric had prepared for this situation by sending a trusted noble named Theodas to Hispania to keep an eye on his grandson, but Theodas became comfortable there and married a rich heiress. Using her wealth to maintain a private army, he began to identify with Hispania after Eutharic's death and became Amalric's main advisor. When Theodoric died, his grand Gothic kingdom died with him, since the Visigoth kingdom regained its independence under Amalric, who married Clovis's daughter Clotilde the year his grandfather died. Basically, the respective advisors of the two young kings made an arrangement and accepted a non-violent separation of the kingdoms. Honestly, the separation should not be a surprise, since the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths had only been united in 511, but there were few actual connections between the two kingdoms. They had few family ties and no history of joint military campaigns. In time, they might have formed a large kingdom, but Eutharic had died, so they broke apart. The separation of the two Gothic kingdoms following the death of Theodoric greatly weakened the Ostrogoth kingdom. Aside from the absence of tax revenue from Hispania, they no longer shared the defense of Gothic-controlled Provence. Actually, many Ostrogoths were based in garrisons in Visigoth, Hispania, and many chose to remain there, further increasing the number of Theodos's followers. Admittedly, the Ostrogoth army in Italy had been weakened by the separation from Hispania, but even so, the Ostrogoths went on the defensive, which made Frankish expansion easier. Hermanfrid, king of the Thuringians, had married Theodoric's niece Amalaberga around 510, likely motivated by Clovis's continued expansion. The marriage alliance may have ensured the continued autonomy of Thuringia, at least while Theodoric was alive, but the collapse of the Ostrogoth kingdom left Thuringia vulnerable to Clovis's sons. Hermanfrid died resisting an invasion by Theodoric and Clothar sometime between 531 and 534. His niece Radegund became Clothar's wife. The fact that Clothar married into the royal family shows that the conquest was not complete, so he wanted to strengthen his support in the region. While the sons of Clovis had avoided a struggle between themselves, tensions would undoubtedly expand if they did not find an outlet for their restless young men who wanted land. A major target was the Visigoth kingdom to the south, and the Franks began to look at Narbonne with lust in their eyes. The first major invasion was carried out by Childebert in 531, officially in revenge for King Amalric's mistreatment of his wife Clotilde, Childebert's sister. Childebert defeated the Visigoths near Narbonne, and Amalric was later killed in Barcelona. Clotilde was rescued, but she died on the way home. Despite the death of the king, the walls of Narbonne held out, but the region itself became dangerous, so large numbers of Visigoth refugees streamed into Hispania. Amalric was succeeded by Theodas, the Ostrogoths sent to Hispania by Theodoric as his viceroy, who had forged alliances with the local aristocracy. Clearly, those connections have been strong since he became king. Finally, the Frankish kings united to defeat King Godemar of the Burgundians in 532, and the kingdom was divided between Clothar and Childebert and their nephew, Theodebert, son of Theodoric. Actually, the conquest of Burgundy is an excellent opportunity to examine the reason why the sons of Clovis had remained united. The four brothers had expanded outwards instead of fighting each other, but they could have easily formed independent kingdoms. Instead, they often combined to attack a neighbor. This unity probably had less to do with strong familial bonds and more to do with the example of the Burgundians. The Burgundian kingdom had been more powerful than the Franks, but the Burgundians had become weaker because Gundobad had fought his brothers. Over the course of decades, the Western Roman Empire had experienced invasions by the Visigoths, the Burgundians, the coalitions of the Vandals, the Alans and the Suebi, the Franks, and the Alemanni. The Vandals and the Alans had conquered Carthage, while their former allies, the Suebi, had remained in Hispania until they had lost control of most of the peninsula to the Visigoths. The Alemanni had been swallowed by the Franks, while the Burgundians had been gradually worn down by Frankish invasions until they had finally submitted. Finally, the mighty Visigoths had been driven out of Gaul by the Franks. However, Frankish domination of Gaul was threatened by the Ostrogoths in Italy. Admittedly, they appeared weaker following the death of Theodoric. Still, they might have expanded north out of Italy. which would have brought them into direct conflict with the Franks. Except they suddenly found themselves dealing with an invasion from the east. To sum up, Clovis's 4 sons agreed to divide the Frankish kingdom between them and expand outwards rather than fight each other. In theory, their expansion would have been blocked by the combined Gothic kingdom of Hispania and Italy, but Theodoric's succession plan fell apart when his son-in-law Eutharic died. Theodoric died several years later and was succeeded by his grandsons in Hispania and Italy. Unsurprisingly, the Visigoth kingdom in Hispania separated peacefully from the Ostrogoth kingdom in Italy. Once the Grand Gothic kingdom broke apart, the Ostrogoths were too weak to block the Franks' expansion. As a result, the 4 Frankish kingdoms conquered first the Thuringians and then most of Burgundy, although one of the brothers died in the fighting. In fact, the Ostrogoths did not aid the Visigoths against a Frankish invasion. Obviously, the Franks' next target was Italy, but the situation changed when the Byzantine Empire made an attempt to retake the former Western Roman Empire. I will examine the situation in the Eastern Roman Empire next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.